All right, let's talk about Karl Marx and his view of the world, and that'll get us into the command economies. First off, starting with Karl Marx, to really understand Karl Marx, you have to kind of understand what was going on when he was alive. Karl Marx, when he was alive, he was living in the world of the Industrial Revolution, meaning that the world was rapidly changing, that many people were moving and working into factories. And you had owners of the factories who made a lot of money, while the majority of people were moving into these industrialized factories from the farms and had to work for these rich owners. So Karl Marx, from starting, he would say, if we looked at all through history, we would see that basically there have been different economic systems that have come in. He first would have talked about feudalism. And he would have said in feudalism, what you would see is that, pretty much you have a lord or a noble on top, a king above them, but you'd have kind of like a triangle. So if you drew a triangle out, you would have a lord or a noble on the very top. Underneath them, you would have, the huge group of peasants, which would be underneath them. And the peasants would be working for the lord or noble, growing the crops, and the nobles and the lord made most of the money. This happened in Europe, this also happened in China, and this would be called feudalism. Then what kind of happens is things evolve and things change, and there becomes like a business class of people. And these business class of people are the merchants, they're the traders, and they begin to make some money. Well, they make their money, and pretty much they would become a transition in the society where they would become the bourgeoisie. And these merchants, or later Marx would call the bourgeoisie, they're the ones who run the factories, who run the industries, and control trade. So it's kind of like power shifts from the lords and the nobles to this business class called the bourgeoisie. And Marx would say, now that we're looking at, basically for the most part, I'm really simplifying this because Marx writes thousands and thousands of words of this, he basically says it's now society has moved to the bourgeoisie, who are the haves, who basically control and own the means of production. That they control and they own the means of production. And underneath them you have what he would call the proletariat. And the proletariat would be basically your working people. And he would say this is class struggle. And he would also say, throughout all of history there would be class struggle. If you go back to Rome, the patricians and the plebeians, if you look at anywhere, you'd have class struggle of the haves and the have-nots. And he would say, so now we have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which he would say is capitalism. And that's our free market economies we've talked about. So he would disagree with Adam Smith that self-interest is good for everybody. He would say, no, self-interest is good for the people on top, the bourgeoisie or the rich. But it's not good for the proletariat. And what he would say is now we have a defined class system of two people, the haves and have-nots, and eventually what's going to happen is these proletariats aren't going to take it anymore after a while, and they're going to have a violent revolution. So you have capitalism, and there would be a violent revolution against capitalism, which would lead to, at first, socialism, and then communism. So he would say socialism is what would happen when the proletariat had their violent revolution and overthrow the bourgeoisie, and this would be the time where they would be working towards communism. So the time period of socialism is kind of like the waiting room for communism. It's getting everything set up where you would have the central planners planning everything out, and socialism would be where everybody owns everything but through the government, and eventually they would work on this and set up a system to where communism would come, where communism would be where everyone is given according to their need, not their want, and everyone has everything they need and everything is shared pretty much equally. And that would be the communist system eventually coming in after socialism. And this is what Karl Marx writings are, majority of them are about. And he writes thousands of pages, have lots of examples, and he pretty much says that, the workers deserve more than what they're getting because they're being exploited, and there's a class struggle between them and the bourgeoisie. One theory he would use to explain part of this would be the surplus value theory. So a question to think about this is when workers produce a value, who deserves to receive it? So like if I build something, like let's say we have an iPad. Here in the green you see the price for an iPad right here. So here's the price what an iPad costs. Here's everything that goes into making the iPad. So we have the pink down here, the cost of the parts, the cost of paying the workers to put it together, the cost of transportation and advertising, the cost of design and management. And on top, we have the surplus value. This is the profit, where the people who own the factory, typically they get this. Where Marx would say, this is what's wrong with the system, is the fact that the surplus value belongs to the workers and shouldn't go to the owners. He would say that it should be put into the cost of labor because they built it, they own it, not the people who started the factory. And this is what basically Marx is saying, and this takes us into our command economies. So before we get to command economies, let's explain how they kind of get started. So let's talk about Russia's rush to industrial revolution and how it leads to revolution. So Russia is kind of like a lab experiment for communism to see if it can work. So what happens is, if we're looking at Russia in the 1800s, the Tsar, or basically the king of Russia at that time, Tsar comes from Caesar, which comes from Rome, which pretty much means the king or dictator. So the Tsar of the Tsar of Russia was very cruel. And Russia was trying to industrialize very rapidly. They were trying to industrialize, they were trying to modernize, because they were mostly a farming nation. This was in the 1800s when a lot of their European counterpart countries like Germany, Britain, and France had already industrialized. What I mean by industrialized is taking their jobs from people making things by hand or farming to moving into factories to produce larger numbers or mass production. The workers experienced horrible conditions. The farmers were not valued very much in the society. And it was horrible conditions. The working hours were long, they were hard. It was also a racist system, especially anti-Semitic against Jewish people. And it was a horrible place to live in for the average worker. To top that, there was a lot of starving going on because they were trying to move people from farms into the factories. And add to that, World War I breaks out, and Russia joins World War I. And basically the country is going bankrupt and the Tsar can no longer keep power. Well, there's a revolution, and I'm going to summarize this very, very, very briefly. There's a revolution that goes on in Russia where the Tsar leaves to see how the military is doing in World War I, and pretty much then there's a revolution where the group called the Bolsheviks are able to take power. Now there's another group that is fighting against them called the White Army. The Bolsheviks are the Red Army. But what's really important to know here is that the Bolsheviks win. And the Bolsheviks want to bring communism to Russia, and what will become the Soviet Union, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they bring in Marxism under Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's leadership. Lenin, not John Lennon. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who becomes the leader of communism in the Soviet Union. Now, Vladimir Lenin's interesting because he's trying to make communism happen. He's trying to move people towards there, but he's having a tough time with the farmers because he can't, make them produce things. So he's actually using a little bit of capitalism in this thing called the New Economic Policy. And it doesn't go over well with some of the other leaders. And when he passes away, Joseph Stalin comes in and he forces the idea of socialism working towards communism on the people in Russia. And this means that many people, if you don't farm, you don't do what you're told, you are put in basically camps in Siberia. And so Russia is trying to industrialize, they're trying to modernize still, and they're trying to do it under a communist system. So let's explain how a lot of these modern command economies come about. Many of these socialist communist economies come after the Soviet Union. First off, socialism. Socialism, again, by definition, is supposed to be a period between capitalism and communism where all the means are owned by the people, and involves having central planners who are in charge of making sure everything gets done. Then you have communism, which is basically everything is owned pretty much by everybody and is distributed evenly. So communism, the work is to try to get the government out of there, but it never really happens that way. So most countries that say they're communist countries, if you actually ask them, they say, no, we're not communist, we're working towards communism. We want to become communist, where eventually our government will just go away. Now, central planning is huge in modern command economies. Now, central planning pretty much means that the production is controlled by planners who try to plan everything out for any good that you would distribute. That could be, for example, light bulbs, shoes. You wouldn't have private people and their businesses make it, driven by self-interest. Instead, you'd have these groups of central planners who would see, well, how many light bulbs do we need? For our whole country, let's make 5 million, and that will cover everybody. And the problem with this you're probably thinking about is, how would you know the right number to produce? And inevitably, what almost always happens with central planners is you either produce too many or too few. So, for example, if you don't produce enough light bulbs, we have in economics called scarcity we talked about, and they would suddenly become very expensive and hard to get. Or you'd have too many, a surplus, and there'd be too many of them produced, and it's inefficient. China, Cuba, and North Korea are communist countries today, although you can really debate strongly if China's a communist country anymore. Anyway, so the problem with central planners, too, is that they basically become corrupt after a while. Now, the reason why is because if you're a central planner, and let's say you are running something like, meat that's used for the people, or that can be bought, if there's no meat available and there's a shortage because you didn't make enough, well, if you want meat, you just go to the central planner and you can give them a bribe, and a lot of times you can get it. So these central planners actually become very powerful in many different areas. And they gain power, and it's almost like the central planners and the leaders who are planning all these things for the economy, they become the new elites, and they have power over everything that is produced. And lots of errors happen too with central planning. Let me just throw out an example for you. In the Soviet Union, they decided that all factories had to have light bulbs to keep working. But in homes, they were only going to make a certain amount. So the priority was if a factory lost a light bulb or broke a light bulb, they'd replace it right away. But in a home, no, you wouldn't do that, and it was actually hard to find light bulbs. Well, eventually factory workers figured this out, and a black market kind of developed. What would happen in the Soviet Union is, like, a factory worker would go and they would unscrew a light bulb, take it out, and then they could either put it in their own home or they could sell it to somebody because they were a scarce good now. And this happened a lot with central planning. And again, a lot of bribes would happen in central planning. Let me give you another example. When I was living in Turkmenistan, which is an economy that's kind of a command economy still to this day, tickets for traveling across the country. You could travel across the country, and they have airplane tickets, and they would sell them 15 days before the flight used to leave. Well, the day before, and they would sell them for like $2. So it was real cheap to get them because they thought everybody should be able to fly across the country. But they'd sell them 15 days before the flight. So the day that it went on sale, there was a mad rush always to get these plane tickets. People throwing elbows, pushing, trying to get a ticket. Unless, of course, you knew the guy who was working at the air station, you found him, and maybe you slipped him a little bit of extra money, and then magically you could get a ticket for that day. So corruption happens, which has been really epidemic in a lot of command economies. This kind of goes into the impact of command economies that we see. And there are serious errors of the central planning which often lead to shortages, and also with a loss of self-interest. Shortages. Command economies are plagued by shortages. You might have enough money to buy something, but often it won't be available. An extreme example of this would be North Korea. In North Korea, it's hard to get people to farm when they really can't make profiting. They can't profit off their farming. And if they don't farm, they can be thrown in jail. And it doesn't lead to much food being produced, where like in a market economy, people farm because they want to make money off it. So when you get a lack of food, that's a serious problem for a country. It can lead to starvation. And corruption and inefficiencies in the government have led to many people starving to death in North Korea. And North Korea is an extreme example. But there are shortages of goods. This has been epidemic in almost all command economies, from Cuba, North Korea. China had this problem for a while, not as much anymore. The Soviet Union had this problem as well. So shortages are pretty much epidemic in a command economy.